Welcome to this WiseOwl Report Builder tutorial. In this video we're going to explain how to create drill-through reports using charts. We'll begin by creating the target report, including adding the optional hidden parameters that make the entire system work. Then we'll explain how to create a parent report with a chart and how to assign drill-through actions to the chart columns. We'll then have a look at a couple of different types of charts, including how to add actions to charts with both a category and a series group. And then once we've deployed all those reports to the report server, how you can hide the target reports in the web portal. So let's get started. So here's the aim of the video. We want to create some charts whose data points we can click on to drill through to see the underlying details. So this chart is showing the average runtime of films based on which genre the film belongs to. And if I click on any particular column, let's go for the one for animation films, that will load a second report, passing a value to a hidden parameter of that report, filtering the list to show only films in that particular genre. If I go back to the parent report with this button, I can click on a different genre altogether and get an entirely different set of films, but using the same drill-through report. We can make this work for basically any type of chart. If I head back to the parent report and go to the second page, I've got a pie chart sitting here. I could click on the slice of pie, which is going to show me the total runtime of all the films by the particular certificate which is assigned. So let's click on the U certificate, and that will use the same report to filter by all films with that certificate assigned in any genre. And then we can combine those with more complex looking charts, not necessarily attractive looking charts I should mention, but nonetheless slightly more complex. This one showing the average runtime broken down by genre and certificate. So now I can click on any individually coloured block. Let's go for animation films with the U certificate, and that will filter by both columns, both certificate and genre. Again, we can do this with other types of charts. There's this fairly horrible looking tree map type thing where the size of the square represents the sort of the quantity of the value, so I can find the total runtime by certificate and genre. I've got some tooltips in action there just to make my life a little easier so I can see what it is I'm about to click on when the labels are masked. So I'll go for Universal Certificate Science Fiction movies, and I'll get a short list of those as well. So that's the sort of thing we'll aim to create. If you want to follow along, you'll need a copy of the WiseOwl Movies database, and as always, if you don't already have that installed, you can use this video to help you get it set up. There's a link in that description there you can use to download the file you'll need. If you have done that, I've got a blank report waiting for me in Report Builder, and the first thing we'll do here is create the child report or the target report that shows the list of films for a particular combination of certificate and genre. The first thing I'll do is create a data source which will connect to the WiseOwl Movies database. So I'll right-click on my data sources folder and choose Add Data Source. I'll change its name so that it's called Movies and use an embedded connection, pointing to a Microsoft SQL server, and then select the Build button to get some help with the connection string. For the server name, I'm going to type in a full stop followed by a backslash, and then my SQL Server instance name is called SQL 2017. Once I've done that, I can click on the drop-down list down here and choose the Movies database, and then click OK a couple of times to create the data source. Next, I'm going to create the dataset by right-clicking on the Movies data source and choosing Add Dataset. And I'll call this one Films. I'll use the query designer so I don't have too much work to do, and I'm going to start in the film table to pick a few columns from there. So let's expand the film table. I'll go for the title, the release date, and the runtime minutes. From the certificate column, I'd like to be able to display the certificate in the table, so I'll check the certificate column. And then similarly, I'll go for the genre column from the genre table. Having done that, I'll click OK, and then OK again, and that's my data set created. Finally, I'll just display those values in a simple table. I'll tidy up my report first by removing the page footer, get rid of the title text box at the top, right-click into the report body and choose to insert a table. Then assign those 5 columns I've selected, so title, release date, runtime minutes, and then I can drag in the certificate and the genre columns and attach those to the right-hand side of the table. I'll just make sure I don't encounter this font rendering bug, which I'm sure you've encountered by now if you've followed any of the other videos in this series. Often when you run a report with a table in it for the first time, it doesn't display most of the text in the table. That affects me all the time. So the simplest way to solve it is to highlight all the cells in the table and switch away from the default font and then back to the default font, and that should stop that from happening. I'll then just move the table up to the top left-hand corner and then just resize some columns, make sure that I can read the genre on a single line. I'll also format the release date, so it's got a nice date format. Highlight the column headers and then just change the background color, make the font bold perhaps as well. And then I can give this report a quick test run to make sure it all looks pretty sensible. And that looks pretty good to me so far. Next, I'd like to be able to filter this list based on the certificate ID and the genre ID. And to do that, we're going to create a couple of parameters. Let's head back to the design view. Now we can either create our parameters as report parameters first and then assign some filters to the dataset, or we can write our query parameters in the underlying SQL statement that will create the report parameters for us. That's the approach I'm going to take. I'm going to right-click on my films dataset and choose dataset properties. Then in the query dialog box, I'm going to add a where clause to the end of my select statement. So I'll say where, and then I'm going to type in a condition that will check the value of the film.certificate ID column. And I want to check if that is equal to the value of a parameter whose name I'll just make up on the spot now. I'll call it @certID. I'd like to add a second condition then using the AND operator and check where the film.genreID equals, and then make up a new parameter name, genreID. Having done that, I've typed in the names of two query parameters. When I click OK, that will automatically create the corresponding report parameters for me. And if I simply run the report at this stage, I can give it a quick test by typing in some numbers that I just happen to know. I know that the number 5 represents the 15 certificate, and the number 3 represents science fiction films. So if I hit enter at that point, I'll see a list of all the science fiction films with a 15 certificate. Now I'd like to make both of these parameters optional so that I don't have to always pass a value to each one. To do that, I'm going to go back to the design view, and then I can start by double-clicking on the certID parameter. The first thing I'm going to do is actually one thing that isn't entirely necessary. I'm going to change the data type of the parameter to an integer. I'm doing that because integer is the data type of the column we're comparing the parameter's value with in the underlying SQL statement. We've just seen that it works without doing this, but I always think it's sensible to match the data type of your report parameter with the value of the column you're comparing it with. So as well as setting the data type to an integer, I'm going to allow a null value. And because I don't want to have to always provide that null value, I'm going to set a default value for the parameter from the default values page, specify a value, click add, and then just leave the value exactly as it is, the word null in parentheses. I can then click OK, and then I'll do the exact same thing for the genre ID. I can double click on that. And then I can set the data type to an integer, allow a null value, and on the default values page, specify a value by adding null. I can then click OK, and I can run the report at that point. Of course, I'm not going to see anything because there aren't any films where the certificate ID equals null and the genre ID equals null. To make this work, we now have to modify the where clause in the query. So let's head back to the design view, and we can right-click on the films dataset and choose dataset properties. And then I'm just going to click at the beginning of the first criterion we added, film certificate ID equals, and I'm going to open up some round brackets at the beginning of that line. And then after the first condition, I'm going to use the OR operator and ask if the cert ID parameter is null. I can then close the round brackets at the end of that line. After the AND operator on the next line, I'm going to begin a new set of round brackets, and then at the end of that line say OR at genre ID is null, and then close the round brackets. I can then click OK, and I can run the report this time, and we will see that when I don't pass a value to either parameter, I basically get my full list of films. but I can happily pass a value to either one or both parameters by typing a number in, and that will filter the list automatically for the specified genre or certificate. The final thing I'd like to do with these parameters is make them both hidden so that the end user can't see them when they drill through into this report. To do that, we can go back to the design view, and I'll start by double clicking the cert ID parameter and set its visibility property to hidden. As I've mentioned in previous videos, the internal option there allows you to create a hidden parameter whose value can't be changed by anything from outside of the report. So that's completely useless for the system we're setting up here because we need to pass a value in from a separate report into this parameter. So hidden's the correct option, so I'll select that, and you'll see the parameter gets greyed out or ghosted in the grid there at the top. And then I'll do the same thing with the genre ID parameter, set it to hidden, and click OK. Now, because I've set default values for these parameters, I can run it and see a list of all of the films. But, of course, I can't then modify those values by typing into the text boxes at the top. The only way I can influence that is by passing in a value to each parameter from outside of this report. So at this point, I think we're done designing this target report. All we need to do now is save it to the report server so that we can create an action which will launch this report when we click on an item in a chart. To do that, we can head back to the design view, and then I'm going to hit the save button, point to my report server, the one that I was showing you my sample report on earlier. I've got a separate drill through reports folder for these reports, so I can navigate into that. And I'm going to call this one, let's call it chart drill through target. Should be descriptive enough, I think, to spot later on. So there we go. There's our target report saved, ready to be drilled through into. Now let's move on to creating the chart report. I'll head back to the File menu first and choose New, and then choose to create a blank report, which will automatically close down the one we were working on. And then a bit of deja vu, I'll create a new data source by right-clicking and choosing Add Data Source, call it Movies. I really should be using a shared data source, but I haven't got one handily available at the moment, so I'll go with creating an embedded one, pointing to a Microsoft SQL server, and then the server name will be /SQL 2017, and the database I'm going to use is the Movies database. And then I can click OK a couple of times. Then I can right-click on the Movies data source and choose Add Data Set. I'll call this one Films, and then I'll click the Query Designer button and pick some columns from a bunch of different tables. First of all, from the certificate table, I want both the ID and the name, so certificate and certificate. Then likewise from the genre table, I'd like genre ID and genre. And then from the film table, any columns that I'd like to aggregate, so anything I want to count, sum, min, max, take the average of, anything. I'm just going to stick with runtime minutes. That will give me more than enough to work with to demonstrate the principle. I can then click OK a couple of times, and that's my data set created. And then I'm just going to tidy up my report a little bit by removing the page footer and also removing the title text box. And then we're ready to start creating some charts. Now, we haven't really used charts in this playlist so far. We will have a separate section all about charts later on that explains all the details of formatting them, making them look nice. Here, I'm not going to bother trying to make them look in any way attractive. I just want to focus on the drill through functionality. So just the basics you need to know about charts. I'm going to right-click into my report body and choose to insert a chart. And when I do that, I have to pick what type of chart I want. It isn't a fixed choice, you can always modify your chart type afterwards. But I'm going to start with a basic, bog standard, clustered column chart. So the default one that's selected for me there, I can highlight that and then click OK. Now, it's a little misleading. When you first insert a chart, it looks as though it already has some columns full of data displayed. But if you were to run that report, you don't see anything appear. Within the chart, you'll get the basic outline of the grid and the axes, but no actual columns. So it's not what you see is what you get. It's not exactly like it would be in Excel. Just to give myself a bit more space to design this chart, by the way, I'm going to head up to my View tab in the ribbon and switch off the grouping panel and the parameters panel, just to give myself a little more space to work with. Then I can resize my chart. To make it display some actual data, I need to click somewhere within the chart area, and that will expose the chart data panel. The first thing I'm going to do is set a category group. So where it says details, I'm going to create some grouping based on the genre field. In fact, I'm going to do this based on the genre ID. It's usually more efficient to group on a numeric field than it is to group on a text field. So if I first of all group by genre ID, what I can then do is modify some properties of that category group to display the genre name rather than the ID. So I can change the label property here to display the genre name. And then on the sorting page, I can also choose to sort by the genre name rather than by the genre ID. I can then click OK. And finally, to make some columns appear, all I need to do is add something to the values area of the chart. So I can click the little plus symbol in the top right-hand corner here, choose runtime minutes. By default, that will give me a sum of runtime. But if I wanted to change that aggregate function being used, I can click on the drop-down arrow next to where it says sum of runtime minutes, choose aggregate, and then change that to an average instead. Having done all that, I can run my report again. And this time I will see some columns appear. It won't be particularly attractive yet, just as I say, but I've at least got some data displayed. Now, I'm not going to spend too long on the formatting, but there are a few basic things I'd like to do. I'd like to add a chart title, get rid of the legend, change the column colours, make sure I see a label for every single column, and just increase the size of the chart as well. So let's head back to the design view. To modify the chart title, I can simply click into that text box and edit it directly. So I can call this, let's say, AVG Runtime by Genre. To get rid of the legend, I can simply click on that and hit the delete key on my keyboard. To change the column colours, I always have the feeling I should be able to select the columns and then just pick a fill colour from the fill colour tool, but I can't. But I can change the colour in the properties window by finding it from the in the list in the appearance category, click on the drop down arrow and then just pick a different colour. To make the labels appear for every single column, that's a little trickier. I need to select the labels at the bottom of the axis to begin with, and then I can right click on those and choose horizontal axis properties. There is then in the axis options dialog box an interval property. You'll see the exact same property appear on the properties window as well if you'd rather not hunt for it in the dialog box. I want a label to appear for every one column in the chart. So I'm going to replace then the word auto with the number 1 in the interval box. And when I click OK, you'll see that property has been changed in the properties window as well. What I can finally do is just resize the chart so it's a little easier to see. And then when I run the report, that should look a little more presentable. Not much, but a little bit at least. Now let's create the action so that clicking on a column in the chart will show all the films in that genre. If you've already done this using a table or a matrix as described in the previous 2 videos, you'll be right at home here. It's basically the exact same technique, just using a different object to assign the action to. So back in the design view, I'm going to click somewhere within the chart and then click on any one of the columns to highlight the series. I can then either use the properties window by finding the action property here, or I can right click on one of the columns and choose series properties. I can then find the action page on this dialog box, choose go to report, browse for the report that I saved earlier on the report server, so that's in drill through reports and it was chart drill through target. And then we can choose which parameters we pass values to. For this example, I only want to pass a value to the genre ID parameter. I don't care about the certificate just yet. So I can choose genre ID and then pass in the value of the genre ID field. And having done that, if I click OK, I can run the report. And if I hover the mouse over any column, you'll see that I get the follow hyperlink mouse cursor. So it's simply a case of picking the genre I'm interested in. There's crime, let's go for that. And it will load the report filtered for the crime genre. I can click the back button here to get back to the parent report, choose an entirely different genre, and then see films in the newly selected genre. So all that's working pretty well. Now you can apply this same basic technique to any other chart type. Let's head back to the design view, and then I'll give myself a bit of extra space at the bottom of the report page by dragging down the bottom of the page. And then in the new space we've got, I might just zoom out a little bit as well to see this a little more clearly. I can right click in some blank space and choose to insert a new chart. And this time let's go with a pie chart. So I'll select that and click OK. Again, it looks as though the chart does actually display some data to begin with, but of course it doesn't. If I run the report, there's nothing to display yet. If I head back to the design view, I can click within the pie chart, and then that will expose the chart data panel. For the category groups this time, I'm going to choose the certificate ID, and then having done that, I'm going to click on the drop-down arrow and choose category group properties, and then choose to display the certificate rather than the certificate ID for the label. I can then click OK. For the values, I'm going to add in the runtime minutes again, and I'll leave this one as the sum this time. So the end result of that, if I run the report, is some actual data reflecting the dataset I've linked the chart to. It might be useful to display some labels on the pie chart so I can see what values I'm actually looking at. So back in the design view, to add data labels to the pie chart, I can select any of the pieces of pie, or click on any of the pieces of pie, right click on those, and then choose Show Data Labels. I can format those data labels then in a fairly standard way. I can use the standard formatting toolbar, so I'll make them white and bold and maybe increase the font size a little bit. And if I run the report, we'll see the actual numbers for the sum of runtime minutes. But again, what we want to be able to do is click on a piece of pie to see all of the films with that certificate assigned. To do that, back in the design view, I can select any of the pieces of pie, and then I can either use the action menu in the properties window or right click and choose series properties again. But I'll use the properties window this time. On the action page, go to report, browse for my chart drill through target report, I should say. And then this time I'll add the certificate ID parameter and pass into that the certificate ID, click OK, run the report, and this behaves in basically the same way as our previous report does, but clicking on a piece of pie this time shows all the films with that certificate in any genre. Now let's create a chart which has both a category group and a series group so that we can pass a value to both parameters of the target report. I'll head back to the design view, and then I'll just give myself a little more space at the bottom of the report by dragging the page down. And then in this new blank space, I'm going to right click and insert a new chart. This time I'm going to go with the stacked column chart, so the second one along, and then I can click OK. And I'll just resize this so it's a little more readable. And when I've clicked within the chart, I'll get the chart data panel exposed again. I'd like to display the average runtime in minutes, so I'm going to add the runtime minutes field to the values area first. That gives me a sum, and I can change that using the drop-down arrow, choose aggregate, and then AVG. My category groups, I want those to be the genres again, so I'm going to select from the drop-down list, genre ID, and then go back to the same drop-down list and choose category group properties, and then change the label property to say genre rather than genre ID. So at this point, the chart is basically the same as the original one we created. Now I'm going to create a series group, so I'm going to click the plus button in the series groups box, and then I'm going to choose certificate ID, then click the drop-down arrow and choose series group properties and change the label to say certificate. Okay, so having done all that, I'm going to run the report. I may find that this new chart appears on the second page, possibly. Oh, it's just at the bottom of the first page. There we go. So you see all these beautifully coloured blocks here indicating the different certificates for the different genres in the chart. It could do with a bit of tidying up again. I'm going to get rid of the title this time, but I want to make sure I get a label on every single column, and I want these columns to be sorted alphabetically as well. So I'm going to go back to the design view. I'm going to select the chart title and then just hit the delete key to delete it. Then I'm going to select the genre labels on the axis at the bottom and right click and choose horizontal axis properties. And I'll set the interval property to the number 1 and then click OK. And then finally I'm going to right click on the genre ID group in the category groups box, choose category group properties, head to the sorting page and sort by genre as well. Okay, so that should look a little more presentable at this point. One thing that's really not very nice is the colour scheme that's been used. Good luck picking a nice colour scheme from the range of colour schemes that are presented to you in Report Builder, by the way. If I go back to the design view, if I click within this chart, if I find the particular property, it's fairly easy to spot. There's a palette property for a chart. Obviously, I can't select the individual sections in a column to colour them in individually. I could do that with the basic column chart at the start because there was only one colour for everything anyway, but I can't pick the individual coloured blocks in the design view because I don't know how many blocks I'm going to have when the report is running. So the only choice I have is to assign a colour palette at this point. So if I find the palette property, I can select from one of the equally hideous selections of colours. It is possible to create your own custom colour sets, and we'll talk about that in the chart section of the playlist when we get onto that. So for now, I'm just going to stick with the standard Pacific. So again, we now just need to select the action that should be applied whenever we click on one of the coloured blocks. So if I select any of the columns in the chart, find the action property in the properties window, click the ... button, choose to go to a report, click the browse button to pick your drill through chart target report. This time we need to add a value to each parameter of that target report. So I'll click the add button twice, choose cert ID and pass the certificate ID, and choose genre ID and pass the genre ID to that. I can then click OK and I can run the report. And this time, if I find the 18 certificate for action films, let's say, if I click on that pale blue coloured chunk there in the first column, it shows me all the films in the action genre with the 18 certificate. I can go back, scroll down again. If I find the, what should we go for this time? Let's go for the U certificate in the comedy genre. So let's click on that sort of aqua coloured bar there, and that's all the U comedy films. So yeah, that's working pretty neatly. When you have so many different options to click on, it can be a little tricky to work out which thing is which. So at this point, it might be nice to add some tooltips so that when the user hovers over the bit they can click on, it tells them what they're about to get. So to do that, I can go back to the design view. And again, there are several different ways to do this, but I'll start by clicking into the chart and then clicking on one of the columns. At this point, I'm going to right click on the column and choose Series Properties. And then on the Series Properties dialog box, there's a Tooltip property. I could select just any of the individual fields from the list, but it's much easier when I want to create something customized to use the FX button and then build my own expression. So in here, I'm going to start by referencing the genre field. So let's go to the fields list, and I'm going to double click on the genre field name, and that will write that in to the tooltip. I'd then like to concatenate a new line character. There are several different ways to do this. One way that you'll see used fairly commonly is to use a constant called VBCRLF, Visual Basic Carriage Return Line Feed. Several other choices are available, some which make a little more sense. One's called VB New Line, and then I believe there's a different one called Environment Dot New Line. So a variety of choices there to get a new line character in. Once I've concatenated that, I'm going to add another ampersand at the end, and then I'm going to go to my certificate field and double click on that, and then I could concatenate another environment.newline, and then I could introduce the average runtime minutes. So I can say ampersand and then AVG, and then open some round brackets, head to the fields list again and double click the runtime minutes field, and then close the round brackets. Now, when I run that, it's going to come out with quite a large number of decimal places. So I'd also like to format the average so that it only has 2 decimal places. One way to do that is to wrap the average function inside the format function. So I can say, I could say, if I hadn't accidentally gone off the edge of the page. There we go. So I can say format, open some round brackets, AVG, fields runtime minutes value, comma, and then in some double quotes, type in 0.00 and close the extra set of round brackets. So the entire expression looks like this. Having done that, I'm going to zoom out and click OK and OK again, run the report, and then when I hover the mouse cursor over one of the coloured blocks, I get the genre on one line, the certificate on the next line, and the average runtime minutes formatted to 2 decimal places on the next line. It's worth mentioning that you can change your chart type even once you've reached this stage of adding the actions and the tooltips. So let's head back to the design view, and I'd like to create a copy of this final chart we've added. So I'm going to select it first. I can copy and paste it in several different ways. I'm going to click the copy button on the toolbar and then hit the paste button afterwards. Then I can drag the new copied chart down to the bottom of the page, which will expand automatically. And then I can simply right click within the chart area and choose to change the chart type. I'll pick this tree map chart, and what it tries to do is display a different sized square to represent the size of the value. So I'll choose tree map and then click OK, and then let's just have a quick check as to what that looks like. If I run the report, scroll down to the bottom onto the other page, you can see I've got a different colour for each certificate and then a different sized block within each certificate representing the genre. But the tooltips still appear, and I can click on any of the blocks to drill through into the underlying report, and the drill through action still works as well. The final thing I might do just to tidy up the report's design is to add a page break before each chart. So I can do that in a few different ways, but I'm going to right click on my bottom chart and choose Chart Properties, and then check the box which says Add a page break before. Then I'll scroll up and right click on the penultimate chart and choose Chart Properties and check the box for Add a page break before. And then finally the same thing with my pie chart, Chart Properties, check the box for Add a page break before, and then click OK. So that means when I run the report this time, each chart occupies its own separate page, making each one a little easier to read. And of course we could increase the size of those even further so they're even easier to read. To finish things off, I've just saved this report into the same folder as the target report on the report server. And if I navigate into that folder in the Reporting Services web portal, I'll find that I've got my chart parent report. I can click on that, and then clicking on a column in the chart will drill through and display the results I've selected. So everything works normally and fairly intuitively for the end user. One thing you might consider doing is hiding the target report within the report server. So to do that, I can click on the little ellipsis, the ... more options button in the top right hand corner, and then I can choose manage from the menu. There's a checkbox to hide this item, and I can then click apply. And then when I get back to the drill through reports folder, although I can currently see this sort of greyed out, that's purely because I've got my option to show hidden items enabled. So from this tiles menu, I can choose show hidden items to hide those. And there we go. So all the user would see is the parent report, and the only obvious way to get into the target is to click on a column in the chart. If I wanted to bring it back, I can go back to show hidden items, go back to the more options menu, choose manage, uncheck the hide this item box, and then click apply, and then back to the same folder. So there we go. There's the basics of creating drill through charts in reporting services. And we'll have a further video on working with charts in general, try to make them look a little more presentable than the ones I've created here. But hopefully you've enjoyed that, found it useful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.